Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 150. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what's been going on. We actually have quite the story going on, so I will kind of try to streamline it in this explanation. So Swamp Thing has been guided by three mysterious people. They are Don Roberto, who's a shaman from South America, a mysterious traveler who I think is supposed to be Odin, although they never call him by that name, and another man called Senior Blake. And they have been guiding Swamp Thing since the beginning of this run. Specifically, they want him to go to the Black Forest in Germany, where a large battle is supposed to take place that they have been planning for billions of years. Also, at the same time, a being known as the Word has shown up because he does not like the amount of power Swamp Thing is going to have if he successfully completes the trials that await him. So as a countermeasure to that, he has put into motion another obstacle in Swamp Thing's way by manipulating an old villain named Sargon the Sorcerer. And he's got his own plan where he's opening a direct line from hell to heaven, so souls that are trapped in hell will be able to go to heaven. And this is also happening in the middle of the Black Forest. So when Swamp Thing actually shows up in the Black Forest, he first sees Sargon doing this thing, and he tries to fight him, and he was immediately blasted with some magic that seems to have damaged his body very badly. And in the background of this battle, Senior Blake from the Three Mysterious Men has been battling the Word via a card game, which I guess is mimicking what is actually happening in real life where Swamp Thing is fighting Sargon. So as the Word wins, so does Sargon, and as Senior Blake loses, so does Swamp Thing. And I'm not sure on the exact mechanics of how this is actually happening, but the events in the Black Forest and what's going on in the card game seem to be tied together. So that's where we're at right now. Swamp Thing has just got blasted by Sargon's magic, so he's kind of fried in the Black Forest. And at the end of the last issue, we saw Senior Blake lose his first hand out of 3, and the Word winning the first hand. So first things first, with issue 150, we got the cover. We see Swamp Thing is pulling himself out of a little crater in the ground, and there is a hole in his chest about the size of a cannonball, and it is dripping, oozing green liquid. And Swamp Thing is looking out at us very angry. And we also see that this issue is written by Mark Miller with art by Phil Hester and Kim DeMolder. And we start off on the first page in Salisbury Plain, England, and we see a police officer standing outside of his police car, and he is smoking. And he's saying to his partner inside, "I don't believe this. You don't like people smoking in your new squad car? Jesus Christ. It's like being on traffic duty with your friggin' wife." And then their radar gun kind of beeps a little bit, and his partner in the squad car says, "Hey, look, the speed clock's going berserk. I reckon we got bloody Nigel Mansell coming up the road, and he must be doing 150, 160, Christ almighty." And then all of a sudden, an electric shock hits the car, and the officer smoking on the outside falls to the ground. And his partner rushes out of the car, and he says, "Frank!" And Frank is pushing himself up off the ground, and he's holding his face, and he's saying, "Ah, my face! My freaking face!" And as his partner rushes over to help him up, he looks down the road, and he says, "Mary, Mother of God, what the hell was that?" Then we see a crack of lightning happening at Stonehenge, and right where it hits the ground, we see the mysterious traveler appear. So it seems he was the cause of that static shock that hit the officers, because he was traveling up to Stonehenge. And as his body forms, he yells out, "I seek an audience with the Parliament of Stones. Hear me, for I am weary. I have traveled halfway across the world this day and have no desire to repeat myself. The Swamp Thing has reached the Black Forest. I have told him that there he will make his final stand against the Parliament of Trees. He does not suspect what lies waiting for a disturbance in the green. Show me this champion you have selected to challenge him. I demand to see what has become of Nelson Strong." And then he waits for a second, and the stones don't answer him. So he gets kind of impatient, and he says, "It is not wise to embarrass one of my kind. Perhaps you do not recognize a god in human form." And then he makes a fist like he's about to do some kind of magic. We see on his hand he is wearing a ring. And then he yells out threateningly, "Does this make the matters clearer? Now, one more time. "Show me the champion of the Parliament of Stones." And immediately the earth begins to crack underneath his feet, and the ground heaves, and a giant magma-filled stone monster comes out of the ground. And the mysterious traveler looks at it, and he thinks, "Oh my God! Oh sweet Lord! How in heaven's name can Holland stop that?" Then we cut back to the Black Forest, and we see the giant tree that has grown into the heavens that sprouted from an apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we can see at its base, dead bodies are clamoring to climb up it. And we see on this page that the issue is called the Illumination. And we cut to Sargon and Grace standing at the base of this giant tree. And Sargon is watching the dead clamber up it, and he says to Grace, "Look at the sky, Grace. Isn't it magnificent? Heaven's gates are open to the underworld. The migration of souls has begun. Listen to the hymns of the damned. They'll make such perfect angels when the old order is torn down and replaced. You should be proud to take their place in hell." And at this, Grace asks, "Why, Uncle Johnny? Why are you doing this to me?" And Sargon turns to her and says, "You don't understand, do you? It's because I need to shed my material possessions, and you're the only thing that matters to me, Grace. You're the only one I love in the whole world, so you'll have to go. Does that make sense to you?" And as he was talking, he wasn't facing her, his back was to her, and when she doesn't answer, he turns around and says, "Grace?" But he sees that she's not standing there anymore. She's actually run away, and you can see her footprints in the snow. And that's obviously because she doesn't want to become this sacrifice that's going to be in hell. So she runs to Swamp Thing yelling, "Help! For God's sake, somebody help! He's lost his mind!" And then she falls to her knees about halfway to Swamp Thing and vomits. And then she starts to look around frantically because she doesn't know exactly where Swamp Thing landed. And she yells out, "Oh, jeez, where are you? He's going to kill me, you big green jerk. Where the hell are you?" And then she sees something smoldering around the corner of a tree, and she realizes that that is Swamp Thing, so she runs over to it. And this body of Swamp Thing's looking really bad. It's still kind of on fire, and the rest of the body looks kind of like it's burning out from the inside. So when she gets to it, she says, "Oh, please, don't be dead. I can't handle this on my own." But Swamp Thing doesn't answer her, and then Sargon floats down from above and says, "The Swamp Thing is finished, Grace. It's just you and me." But she doesn't want to hear that, and she grabs Swamp Thing's arm and says, "Come on, get up and fight. He's coming to get me." And surprisingly, Swamp Thing actually begins to talk, but of course he's struggling, and he says, "This body is dying. I will have to grow another, even if it means provoking the wrath of the Parliament of Trees. They have waited months for this desperate moment, eager to punish me for my rebellion. I cannot say what might follow me back if I enter the green again. All I ask is that you prepare yourself for the worst." And Grace is just confused about what he said, so she says, "I don't know what you're talking about. Just shut up and help me." And Swamp Thing answers, "Very well. I will be back soon enough." And with that, his body goes limp, but Grace is still holding on to his hand, and as he goes limp, she yells out, "Wait a minute! Where are you going? You're supposed to stay here and fight him!" And then she falls to her knees in despair, and I forgot to mention that on her way to Swamp Thing when she was running and she vomited, she found the doll that Swamp Thing brought that was given to her by Sargon when she was a little girl. So as she kneels in the snow in desperation, she's hugging on to that. And Sargon hovers above her and says, "Save your breath, Grace. The monster's gone. There are forces waiting for him deep beneath the earth. I do not think he will return." But she just cries and says, "Please, please, Uncle Johnny. Oh God, please. I don't want to die. Please don't do this. Please." And it doesn't seem like Sargon is affected by her pleas at all. And he says, "Somebody has to stay behind and suffer, Grace. There can be no heaven without hell by comparison. Those are the rules which bind the world together." And then he kneels down next to her, and it seems like maybe he does feel pity for her, because he says, "I'm sorry. I wish there was some other way, but there isn't. I must leave someone behind I can trust." And also in this panel, we can see that a plant begins to sprout from the ground. And as Sargon tries to, I guess, comfort her, he notices that she's holding on to this doll, and he grabs it and says, "Great Scott, is this the doll I made for your 6th birthday? Have you really kept it all these years?" And as he looks at her face, he notices that she's looking at something behind him, and he asks, "Grace, what's the matter?" And it turns out that what she's looking at is, of course, Swamp Thing's body growing. And before Sargon can turn around, Swamp Thing has grown his body, and he rushes over and grabs Sargon by the cloak. And he raises his fist to strike, and he yells, "Get away from her, now!" And Sargon seems pretty surprised and terrified, and he looks at Swamp Thing and says, "Now let's be reasonable about this." And just as he says that, the earth begins to shake and heave below their feet, and there's a loud rumbling noise coming from the ground. And Grace is terrified, and she yells out, "Uncle Johnny, what are you doing?" And Sargon replies, "This has nothing to do with me, niece. The very earth beneath our feet boils and seethes with ancient rage." And Swamp Thing actually thinks he knows what's going on, and he says, "My God, the Parliament. I did not suspect their attack would follow so quickly." And just as he says that, a man made out of rock bursts from the ground, and he is gigantic. He's maybe 4 or 5 times bigger than Swamp Thing. And I say a man because he, is in a humanoid form. He's got 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, and a head. But he is made completely out of stone. So he lumbers over to Swamp Thing and he yells out, "You stupid bastard! You just made the biggest mistake of your life." And then he raises his fists and punches Swamp Thing in the face, tearing Swamp Thing's lower jaw off. And Swamp Thing's body flies like 20 feet away and lands in the snow. And the rock monster follows and says, "You were warned countless times never to enter the green again, but you disobeyed. Do you know what that means? It means you have lit the fuse under your own bonfire. It means I'm going to kick the shit out of you." And then his arm begins to change. Instead of looking like a human hand, it forms into a giant stone spike. But as we turn the page, we cut away from there to Peru and back inside the bar where the Word is playing cards with Senor Blake. And the Word says to Senor Blake, "I have shown you my cards, El Senor Blake. Now, show me yours. Do you have what it takes to defeat the Word?" And Senor Blake answers, "No, hooded man, I guess I don't. Looks like you win again." And then the Word brings up his hand, and he forms a crystal orb in it. And as he looks inside of it, we can see he's watching the fight of Swamp Thing versus the stone monster in it. And he says to Senor Blake, "The end draws closer, Dark One. The timeless forces gather like hungry wolves, licking their lips and baying for the blood of the elemental. Watch as he struggles against the Earth Thing. I doubt if he will even survive the ordeal of the bleeding tree. His demise is no longer in question." And Senor Blake sneers at him as he smokes his cigarette and says, "What's the matter with you, hooded man? You got no pity in your old black heart?" And as the Word deals the next round of cards, he snaps back, "Save your pity, Blake. The elemental's plight is nothing compared to the pain I shall deliver if I win this final game." And then Senor Blake pours himself a drink and says, "The Swamp Thing's headed for great things, hooded man. My folks been planning this for more than 1 billion years. All I'm asking for is a chance to show what he can do." And the Word replies, "You have already been given 3 chances to stay my hand, Blake. The Forgotten Laws have granted you 3 games of cards. I have beaten you twice. Now silence. There must be no more distractions. It is time to play our final game." And we see on the outside an ominous bolt of lightning crashes through the sky. Then we cut back to the Black Forest, and Swamp Thing and Nelson Strong are still fighting. And Swamp Thing is still on the ground, but in a new place, so apparently he's gotten hit again, and once again he got knocked off his feet. And as the rock monster rushes over to him, Swamp Thing yells out, "Who are you? You are not an agent of the Parliament of Trees." And the rock monster answers, "I serve a higher order, green man. A body as old as the earth itself. Do you not recognize me? I was a man not so long ago, but you set me on fire and hit me with a tram car. My name was Nelson Strong, but you took that away. And then he reaches down into the earth and grabs a large boulder and pulls it up. And as he brings it over his head to throw at Swamp Thing on the ground, he says, "Look into my eyes. Can't you see the hatred? Do you see the anger burning in my soul?" So Swamp Thing does just that. He looks into the stone monster's eyes, and he grows his fingers into bark-covered points. And in answer to the stone monster's question of, "Do you see the anger burning in my soul?" Swamp Thing answers, "No, I just see two soft targets." And then his arm grows extremely fast, striking at the rock monster's eyes. And his fingers do hit one of the targets. They strike the rock monster's right eye. And this makes the rock monster fall to its knees, and he says, "Ah, shit! That wasn't funny, you bastard! That hurt!" But as he says that, he kind of smiles and looks up at Swamp Thing with his one good eye, and then he opens his mouth and vomits magma onto Swamp Thing's body. And as Swamp Thing begins to dissolve in the magma, the rock monster continues talking, saying, "The Parliament of Stones were waiting for me when I died. They needed a soldier to fight for them in a 1 billion-year-old war." And then he raises his arms, and a giant spike of rock shoots up from the ground, and it is being controlled by him. It's not like part of his body, but it is moving as he moves his arms. And the rock monster continues saying, "They were looking for someone to destroy you, someone who despised you with every fiber of his being." And then the rock monster brings its arms down, commanding the giant spike to hit Swamp Thing. And as it's about to hit, Swamp Thing says, "Oh God." And then the rock point smashes into Swamp Thing. We don't really see where it hits though, but it does seem like it was about to hit his head. And then the rock monster continues his story about being asked to become the champion of the Parliament of Stones, and he says, "I volunteered like a shot." Then we turn the page and we cut back to Peru and the card game with the Word and Senior Blake. And Senior Blake is smiling as he places his cards down on the table face up, showing the hooded man, and he says, "3 aces, hooded man. Beat that." And the hooded man looks at them and says, "I believe I can." And then he reveals his cards, which are a royal flush in the suit of diamonds. And all the bravado and hubris goes out of Blake's face, and he says, "I lost. Just like that. I don't believe it." And the Word says to Blake, "You have failed, Senior Blake. The verdict of the Word must be honored. The elemental has been weakened by the Earth Thing and is vulnerable to attack. I swear now, by all that's holy, that I shall annihilate him this very night." Then we turn the page and we cut back to the battle, and we see the rock monster, aka Nelson Strong, aka the Earth Thing, is being struck by lightning, and he yells out, "Ah, what are you doing? I had the green man on his knees. I don't need your help to finish him." Then we cut to a panel of Grace and Sargon, who are taking shelter behind a tree during this battle, and Grace is asking Sargon, "What's going on? Who's he talking to?" And Sargon replies, "The creature's masters have waited millions of years for this confrontation. They cannot risk defeat now. I'd imagine they're simply increasing his raw energy levels." Then we cut back to the Earth Thing, and streams of rock are going into his body from the ground, which are causing his body to grow into a gigantic version of himself. And as the rocks go into him, he yells out, "It hurts! God help me, it hurts so much! I can't take any more weight!" And as the shadow of his growing figure overtakes Sargon and Grace, Grace says, "Oh jeez, this is too much!" And Sargon says, "Don't be afraid, Grace. Uncle Johnny's here. I won't let this creature harm you." Then we cut to Swamp Thing at the feet of the giant Earth Thing, and he's looking up at this rock titan as his body recovers from being melted by the magma, and he says, "Oh no." And then the colossus that is Earth Thing leans down and grabs Swamp Thing with his hand, and he kind of smiles and he says, "Don't say anything. Just scream." And as his grip begins to tighten around Swamp Thing's begging, saying, "Wait! They won't let me come back. I won't be able to build another body. Don't!" But he's not able to finish as the Earth Thing claps its hands together and smashes Swamp Thing's body. And Swamp Thing's blood is covering the Earth Thing's hands, and he looks at them and he says, "It's over. The Swamp Thing is dead. I beat him. I finally beat him." Then we turn the page and we cut back to Peru, where the word is saying to Senior Blake, "It was a noble effort, Blake, but you have lost. Accept what destiny has written." And then Blake takes a drag of his cigarette and he says, "Damn, I wanted to settle this in a civilized way. Now it looks like old Blake's gonna have to get rough." And the word is kind of surprised by this and he says, "What? Do you dare threaten the word?" And then Blake looks up and stares at him straight in the eyes and he says, "Take a look inside my mind, hooded man. Don't say nothing. Just take a look. You still want to mess with me?" And as the hood stares into Blake's eyes, all of a sudden, seems like he loses a lot of his bravado and maybe even gets a little scared. But he doesn't say anything, and Senior Blake looks at him and says, "I don't think so, huh?" And the word replies, Damn you, Blake. Oh my lord." And then he gets kind of angry and frustrated and throws his hood on and he says, "I will go for now, but understand that your meddling has doomed every living thing upon this earth. The elemental has been spared for now, but I shall return in 2 years' time, and not even you will be able to stop me then. Heed my words, Blake. Not even you." And then the word disappears in a puff of smoke, and as the smoke wafts away, the facade of Senior Blake also goes away, and he says kind of concerned, "Jesus, I can't believe I pulled that off." Then we cut back to the Black Forest, where a seemingly victorious Earth Thing is stomping around, smashing the trees in the area. And because of this, Grace and Sargon are taking flight and they're running away. And as they do, Grace says, "The Swamp Thing's dead! Oh, great!" But as they take shelter under some nearby trees, Sargon turns around to look at the giant monster and he says, "No, Grace, he's still alive. There's still a floral intelligence on the periphery of this world. I suspect the swamp monster is merely preparing his counterattack." And it seems he is right, because just as he says that, moss begins to grow up from the ground and cover the rocky skin of the Earth Thing entirely. And Sargon continues saying, "Timed perfection. Some regard infallibility as a sign of arrogance. I consider it a virtue." And the Earth Thing is looking at his body kind of confused and he says, "No, this isn't fair. What are you doing? Jesus Christ, what are you doing?" And with that, his whole body is engulfed by this mossy green growth. Then we see some kind of vapors coming out through the moss as if something was eating away at the stone beneath. Then we get some talking from Swamp Thing. I'm not sure if other people can hear it, like if the moss itself is talking, or if this is just inner narration. But either way, Swamp Thing says, "My mistake was in attempting to match the sheer brutality of this creature. I did not pause to consider that the solution to my problem might exist within myself. The rhizosphere, this tiny space between us, is teeming with fungi and bacteria. By secreting my natural nutrients, I can facilitate the growth of microorganisms to accelerate its metabolic rate and produce a concentrated acid, powerful enough to mineralize the rock and dissolve this monstrosity into a harmless gas." And as he's saying this, we're seeing the moss and the rock monster kind of get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually all that's left is a wisp of fumes in the air and some plant material that falls to the ground. And Sargon says, "Very impressive. It's rather intelligent, isn't it?" And then, hoping that Sargon might have forgotten what was going on before this battle, Grace asks, "So what now, Uncle Johnny? Can I go home?" And then Sargon just quietly walks away from her, and he's holding her doll, and he says, "I'm afraid nothing's changed, my dear. The pits of hell are draining fast, and a scapegoat is still required. Would you like to take your doll for company?" And of course, Grace is not happy to hear this, and she says under her breath, "You bastard!" And Sargon hears this, and he turns around and says, "Grace, where on earth did you hear a word like that?" And Grace says again, "You bastard! You shitty, shitty bastard!" And then she begins to cry and says, I loved you more than anything in the world. You were the only one, Uncle Johnny. The only one who ever said anything nice to me. How could you do this to me? How could you be so shitty? And then Sargon turns around and he holds the doll up and he says, But Grace, I do love you. I would never. But then he stops as he looks down at the doll in his hands and he sees that now the head of it is broken and the top part of its skull is bashed in. And I guess he has a revelation from this and he says, Oh my dear God, what have I done? And then he turns around in shame and he hugs the doll, and behind him he hears Grace yell, Shut up, you bastard! Get away from me! Go to blazes and don't ever come back! I hate you! And then he turns around again and he looks at her and says, I'm sorry, Grace, I really am. Please, find it in your heart to forgive me. I never meant to hurt you, I swear. And then he drops the doll and he says, Now I must do what is right. And then he does some kind of magic, and his body is engulfed in a blinding white light. And Grace shields her eyes from this, and then as she brings her hands down, all she sees is a wisp of smoke in the air, and Sargon's body is gone. And then Grace spits at where he was standing and says, Burn in hell, you bastard! And as she says that, all of a sudden there's a crack of lightning through the air, and her attention is brought back to the fact that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is still there. It is still grown into the heavens, and the dead souls are still going up it. And she looks up and says, Oh my God, the tree! I forgot about the dead things climbing the tree! But then Swamp Thing in his new body walks up next to her and says, Run, Grace. Get away from here. I will try to stop these creatures. And then he begins to climb the trunk of the tree, and we can see instead of dead bodies now, there are kind of glowing orbs of souls that are floating up the tree. And there are hundreds of them. And Grace calls down from below, Come on, there's too many of them. You're wasting your time. And Swamp Thing calls back down, There is one chance, one way to block this unholy ascension. Pray to God it works. Then Swamp Thing grows his hands and they meld into the tree. And then his narration says, I plunge my fingers into the black heart of the forest and almost fall to my knees in awe. The sum of humanity's worries and fears nuzzles on my subconsciousness, and I offer myself as an alternative host, a sacrifice to divert the dark spirits from the tree. And then we see Swamp Thing kind of crying out in pain as he struggles, and his orange eyes turn black, and the narration continues saying, An obsidian rush shoots through my arteries as every poisonous thought in the world floods my mind. My body buckles under the pressure, and I realize that I am about to die. Then we see Swamp Thing steel himself, and his narration says, No, these evil souls have ventured where my power is greatest. They are vulnerable to my wishes and will do as I desire. I internalize their toxins and transmute them into perfumes, an alchemical transubstantiation within my soul. The surrounding woodland bursts with life and goodness, the seasons reversing in a technicolor blur, until winter becomes autumn, and autumn becomes summer, and finally rests in spring. And as his narration says this, in the panels we're seeing the snow melt away, and the ground turning green, and lots of new trees and growth begin to sprout, until finally it settles on spring, and we see the giant tree that was the tree of knowledge of good and evil is still pretty tall, but it is not reaching into the heavens now, and it is blossoming with pink flowers. And now Swamp Thing and Grace stand at the base of the tree, and Grace says to Swamp Thing, You did it! You cleansed the tree! And Swamp Thing says, The gates of paradise have been locked again. The illumination of the damned has ended. And Grace smiles at him, and then she asks, Will everything be, okay? I mean, it looked like a lot of demons broke through up there. And Swamp Thing kind of squints as he looks up at the tree's boughs like he's thinking, and he says, Do not worry. There is nothing left to fear. Hell's route to heaven has been closed. I am sure those who escaped will be dealt with. And then Grace sheepishly walks towards Swamp Thing and she says, Hey, will you shut up and give me a hug? Then Swamp Thing walks over to her and gives her a big hug. But of course, just as this nice moment is happening, Swamp Thing looks up like he's in shock and he says, "Oh no, not again. Not now." And Grace releases her hug and says, "Well, what's wrong?" And as Swamp Thing's body begins to unravel and fall apart, he says, "Hold my hands, please. Don't let them take me away." But it's too late. His body completely falls apart, and Grace is left looking at a smoking green mass on the ground, and she says, "Oh my God." Then we see Swamp Thing tumbling through the green, and Swamp Thing's narration says, "A mouth as big as the world opens and swallows me whole. This is the green, the place where I am strongest, and yet I cannot slow my descent. I cannot fight this terrible gravity. A door opens in the endless jade, and I am sucked into a slow and peaceful realm I recognize from some half-forgotten dream. Where is this place? Where on earth am I being taken?" Then we cut to a desolate landscape that is covered with snow. We can see some icy mountains in the distance, and in the foreground we see the mysterious traveler standing and waiting. And then in front of him at his feet, a plant begins to sprout and grow. And as it grows, he says to it, "About time, too. The melt feels strange compared to the green, It's so much slower." And as we see Swamp Thing finishing growing his new body, we see that it has changed. Instead of being completely made of plants, now he has a spine made of stone, his elbows and the backs of his arms are made of stone, and his shins are covered with stone. And I don't think Swamp Thing was expecting this, because he cries out as he finishes building his new body. And then the mysterious traveler turns and walks away from him and says, "Congratulations! You have passed the final level of the Earth Challenge. None of your predecessors have come this far." And then Swamp Thing looks down at his body to try to figure out what's going on, and he sees the stones protruding from his limbs, and he says, "What have you done to me? I feel so heavy." But the mysterious traveler doesn't turn around. He just continues walking towards a cave, and he says, "I have done nothing. A marriage between root and rock has taken place within your body. You destroyed the Earth Thing, and nature has granted you its abilities." And then he turns his head to look back at Swamp Thing and says, "This is good. You will need them to face what lies ahead." And then Swamp Thing begins to follow him into the cave, and he says, "You lied to me, traveler. When we last met, you said I would face the Parliament of Trees in the Black Forest. The creature I fought did not represent them." And we can see with every step that he walks into the cave, his feet are extremely heavy because they're crashing down on the rocky ground. So Swamp Thing is kind of learning how to control his new body. And in this cave, there are like rocky steps going up to a peak, and Swamp Thing is walking up to the top. And the old traveler who's waiting at the bottom of these steps answers Swamp Thing's accusation, saying, "Correct. Its true masters are waiting for you here in the darkness. You have reached the end of the first ordeal, Holland. Welcome to the Parliament of Stones." And as he says this, flames shoot out, and the whole cave is illuminated, and we see that on top of the spire that Swamp Thing is standing on, he is overlooking a giant wall of faces that have been carved, kind of exactly like the Parliament of Trees, where there's like giant trees that have the faces that look like the Swamp Things they once were. Each of these stone faces are different, and we can see some of them look like stone faces we've seen before in reality. Like there's one that looks like the giant heads that are on Easter Island. One of them even looks like the Thing from the Fantastic Four. And we even see the lowest one is of Nelson Strong's Earth Thing face. So Swamp Thing looks at the wall of these faces and he says, "The Parliament of Stones? I do not understand." And the Parliament of Stones answers back,
"You have done well, Holland Mind. The 1 billion-year chasm between the Parliament of Trees and the Parliament of Stones has been bridged. You are now the elemental of the earth."
And Swamp Thing replies,
"Forgive me, but was I not always the earth elemental? The Parliament of Trees told me I was nature's champion."
And the Parliament of Stones answers,
"You were simply the champion of the green, the spirit of the woods and marshes, all that lives and grows. Now you represent the earth as a whole. Long ago, the two parliaments of the earth were as one, but a less crystalline intelligence grew within the hard rock. The Parliament of Trees were formed, and a divorce between the Earth's governors took place. The stars chose you as the catalyst to unite our two parliaments once again, Holland Mind. The Parliament of Trees and the Parliament of Stones offer you our thanks.
And Swamp Thing asked them,
Then the Parliament of Trees no longer seeks to destroy me? Does this mean I can return to my home in safety?
And the Parliament answers,
You have passed the Earth Challenge, but other trials lie ahead. This is only the first of 4 rituals. There are other parliaments waiting to guide you to your ultimate destiny.
And Swamp Thing's kind of shocked by this, and he asks,
Other parliaments? I had no idea. What is this destiny you speak of? What lies beyond the Parliament of Stones?
And they answer him,
It need not concern you now. Go home and reflect upon what you have learned this past year. The Parliament of Waves will summon you when you are ready.
And then it seems like they teleport Swamp Thing out of there because where Swamp Thing was standing, there's just left a puff of green smoke. Then we turn the page and we cut to Gotham City, and we see Grace has returned. And as she's walking back to her apartment, she passes by a homeless person and they ask her, Excuse me, do you live here? Could you lend me a blanket? I'm not a junkie or anything. It's just really cold out here, you know? But Grace just keeps on walking by and doesn't even acknowledge them. I think because she's so depressed, because her face looks very sad. And as she walks by, the person says, Hello? Anybody home? Then she walks into her apartment building. And then we cut to inside her apartment where we see her husband is asleep on the couch as the TV blares in the living room. Then we see her come through the front door and she timidly asks, Paul, are you awake? But Paul doesn't say anything. He is obviously asleep on the couch, but I guess she's hoping that he just wakes up from hearing her voice. So she says a little louder this time, Paul, I came back home. But Paul doesn't stir at all. And she says under her breath, Christ, what's the point? Then she walks out of her apartment and the building and leaves Paul for good, hopefully. Then as she walks down the street, another homeless person asks her,
Excuse me, lady. You got anything to spare? I'm really desperate.
So she reaches in her bag and she says, Here, just give her a hug when things get bad. It always worked for me. And then she hands the man the doll that Sargon made her when she was younger, and apparently it's been repaired because we can see its head and it is not smashed in anymore. Then we come back to Swamp Thing and he is shooting through the different layers of the earth. And as he does this, his narration says,
My essence is dropped like an emerald stone through the opal depths of the melt. Ancient, bloated intelligence watch as I descend in slow motion free fall. A wafer-thin membrane bursts open, and I pass into more familiar waters. The cool green embraces me like a long-lost friend. I am the swamp god, the spirit of the bayous. I had thought that there was nothing left to learn about my abilities, but I was wrong. The Parliament of Stones have given me a taste of my true potential, and I am hungry for more.
Then we see Swamp Thing breach the Earth's surface, and he grows himself a new body. And his narration continues.
Arriving home, I dress myself in more familiar clothes. Spanish moss and hot mud, knitted together with long strands of swamp grass. The soil is warm and welcoming, teeming with a million forms of life. It feels good as I wrap it around me. Good to be back where I belong.
And we can see Swamp Thing examining his new body, looking at the stone protrusions that are now coming out of it, and his narration continues saying,
Dawn breaks high above in the Louisiana sky, and the first light of morning filters through the trees, bathing everything in a glorious ochre yellow. The lovesick heron cries out for its mate, and I think for a moment that I hear her voice. I imagine Abby has left her new love and come home to me. I close my eyes and I picture her, dancing in the water and singing as she twirls around and around with Tefe in her arms. It hurts so much to think of them, but knowing they are happy and well makes things easier. Upriver, dragonflies skim across the swamp water. 2 gators posture and wrestle in the mud, fighting over an empty turtle shell. The world feels so fresh and new, brimming with all kinds of possibilities. I haven't felt this good in years.
And the panel under this narration is very cool. It's a callback to a famous panel from the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run, where Swamp Thing is standing in the Louisiana swamp, and he has his arms stretched out in front of the orange sky of the setting sun. Then we cut back to South America, inside the bar where El Sr. Blake bluffed the word in the card game, and now, instead of playing cards with the word, Senior Blake is sitting at the table talking to Don Roberto. And we're cutting in the middle of their conversation, because Don Roberto is saying, "It gets worse. I heard he welcomed Hell's refugees with open arms, even called them his prodigal sons." And Senior Blake replies, "Crazy man. He always was a bad judge of character. I wonder what happened to the traveler. Should have been here hours ago." And Roberto answers, "You know him, Blake. Late for his own funeral, huh?" Then we hear a crack of thunder and see a bolt of lightning outside. And with that, the mysterious traveler appears right next to their table, and he says, "Sorry, I'm late. I was delayed by an avalanche in Canada." And Don Roberto and Blake were startled when he came in, so Don Roberto says, "Christ, I wish you would stop doing that. You're going to give me a heart attack someday." But Senior Blake says, "Oh, stop moaning, Roberto. Did you get it, traveler? I was worried." And the traveler holds out his hand, revealing Sargon's ruby in his palm. And he answers, "Don't worry, Blake. I've got it. The ruby of life was ours for the taking. I shall keep it safe until the Star Child is born." And Don Roberto says, "It didn't help Sargon much, did it?" And then Blake laughs and he drinks from his bottle and he says, "Ha! I'll drink to that." And then Roberto clinks his bottle against Blake's and he says, "You'll drink to anything, Blake." Then we cut once again to the Black Forest that is now all green and beautiful. And we see some panels zoom in at the base of the tree and then go down into the root system. And we can see deep down in the earth lies Sargon's body, and the roots are digging into it and feeding off of him. And the narration says, "Poised between heaven and hell, he suffers for the sins of the world, a martyr for all mankind. His life had been dedicated to the pursuit of distant concepts and ideas, the spiritual and intellectual illumination of the overmind. He never imagined for a moment it would end like this. Shackled to the world of matter, he endures the pain and suffering of true knowledge, crucified to the earth itself. This is how it feels to love someone enough to give up everything. This is how it feels to be alive. At last he understands. The sorcerer has attained illumination." Then we zoom in on his face, and we can see he has a very content look on it, and it's almost looking like he's having a very pleasant dream. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So it seems Swamp Thing is going to be attaining some new powers from all these different parliaments, and now he can control stone and earth with his powers. And like the Parliament of Stones said, Swamp Thing will be going through the trials of the Parliament of Waves next. But we'll have to wait until next issue to see exactly what that means. So until next time, if you got any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.